It had rained for most of that night, not the polite drizzle Oxford often endures, but a persistent, whispering rain that made the cobbles glisten like old pewter. I remember walking home past Magdalen Tower, the bells sounding too clearly in the damp air, and thinking how time feels longer when it falls in drops. Beneath the archway by the porter's lodge, a lamp trembled faintly against the darkness, throwing its sickly light across the stone. That was where the story began, though I didn't know it then. The porter, old and incurious, told me later that he'd seen a woman pause there just after midnight. She'd worn no hood, though the rain was sharp as needles, and she stood as though listening to something distant. Then, without a word, she slipped a large envelope through the letter slot of St. Hilda's College and disappeared toward the river. By morning, the porter said, the envelope was gone. He hadn't thought much of it until the news came of the woman's death. It was over my breakfast that I first read the name Dr. Eleanor Graves, visiting lecturer in English literature, deceased in her lodgings. The article, small and decently worded, spoke of heart failure and no suspicious circumstances. But a single phrase caught me a proof in preparation at the time of her passing. I glanced down at my crossword, where one clue had been waiting half-solved all morning. The definition read, "Evidence withheld until darkness." 7 letters. The answer didn't come, not yet. I went to St. Hilda's that afternoon, more out of curiosity than duty. The porter showed me the arch, the letterbox, and the dry shadow where the woman had stood. He pointed out, with that peculiar reverence college men reserve for the ordinary, that the lamp had been burning all night without a flicker. I thought then how Oxford breeds its ghosts quietly, through habit rather than tragedy. Inside, the corridors smelt of varnish and wool. Miss Denning, the bursar, met me in a drawing-room that had too many portraits and too little warmth. She spoke with the economical politeness of someone accustomed to discretion. Dr. Graves had been with them only a term, she said. Quiet, exacting, given to long hours. She had lately been editing a colleague's paper for publication. When I asked the colleague's name, Miss Denning hesitated, then deflected, as though the name itself were classified information. She denied any knowledge of an envelope. The room where Dr. Graves had lodged lay across the quadrangle. Small, painfully orderly, as though tidiness were a moral condition. A half-eaten apple on the sill, a pair of gloves arranged neatly beside a book, Paradise Lost, its pages damp along the edges. On the desk stood a typewriter missing the letter R, a detail that should have meant nothing. Yet it stayed with me, this small imperfection in an otherwise disciplined life. I found no envelope, no draft of her work, only a folded slip of paper between the pages of Milton, T. Ashba, single line underlined in pencil, "Evil be thou my good." The handwriting was hers. Scholars love to leave themselves moral riddles. I returned to the street as the rain began again, softer now, turning the air to mist. Across the river, a church bell struck 5, the sound floating like a reprimand. Lewis would later say I looked pleased to have something to think about. Perhaps I was. Not with death itself. Heart failure is a dull companion, but with the silence around it, the kind that feels designed. That evening I sat by my window with a glass of whiskey and reread the obituary. It described her as a devoted scholar of Milton, known for her editorial precision and intellectual rigor. The words were neat, bloodless, like an epitaph drafted by committee. But in the lower column, where the advertisements usually hid, I found a second notice. Funeral arrangements to be announced. Inquiries to Dr. Harcourt, St. Anne's College. I knew the name of an aging lecturer, charming enough when sober, and a man whose work had lately attracted quiet admiration for its fresh interpretations. I wondered, as one does in these circles, how fresh they really were. Outside, the lamplight bled across the rain and guttered faintly in the wind. Somewhere in that tremor lay the first truth. I had missed a thing dropped quietly through the night, unseen by all except a porter, too old to care. Oxford would go on, the bells would sound, and the puddles on the high street would reflect their fragile geometry. But something small and deliberate had been misplaced, and though I could not yet name it, I felt it tug at the edge of my mind like an unfinished clue. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had written only one word in my crossword. Proof. The room had been locked from the inside. Lewis said it like a line from a parlour trick, as if locks obeyed logic more than fear. I remember standing outside that narrow oak door, listening to the echo of our own silence, and thinking how little separates the ordinary from the inexplicable. We'd come to Dr. Graves's college rooms once more, summoned by Miss Denning's discreet unease. She had given me the key reluctantly, as though unlocking it might undo something carefully repressed. The brass handle turned stiffly beneath my hand. When the door opened, the air met us with that unmistakable scent of old paper and neglect layered with the faintest trace of lavender. Nothing was out of place, and that in itself was unsettling. The desk faced the window, its surface bare except for a fountain pen, an unfinished letter, and a glass of water gone stale. Dust outlined where a stack of papers had once lain. A bookcase to the right sagged with poetry, Latin commentaries, and a single spine turned inward, the uses of argument. I drew it out carefully. Inside was a folded page, torn from a student examination script. It bore a single phrase in red ink. You missed the proof. Lewis wandered toward the window where the rain had dried in diagonal streaks. He muttered something about the latch, that it could be locked by pulling the cord from within. A child could have managed it. I nodded absently, more interested in the shadows along the floorboards. The wood there was darker, newly stained. Not from blood, it had been wiped too cleanly for that. But there was polish missing along the edges, a faint square where something once stood, a box perhaps, or a folio case. Miss Denning watched from the doorway, pale as chalk beneath her spectacles. She asked quietly if we would disturb much longer. Her voice had that tremor of moral fatigue I'd come to associate with people who live near secrets. I told her we'd finish soon, though we both knew I was lying. She left us, the latch clicking behind her like punctuation. Lewis leaned against the window frame, frowning. He'd found the letter on the desk, curious, no envelope, half-written, signed with only an initial E. I read it once, then again. It began formally, drifted into intimacy, then ended abruptly on a sentence that refused to finish. The pen had bled slightly at the edge of the page, as though hesitating too long. The words themselves were unremarkable. You were right, the proof was altered after midnight. Altered. That was the word that caught me. Not forged, not stolen. Altered. In the careful lexicon of academia, that meant an act of deceit concealed within precision. I recalled the missing letter from her typewriter, the absent R. Alteration without R left only alteration, a ghost of meaning. My mind began, unwillingly, to play its little games. Lewis found nothing more. The window opened easily once the catch was lifted. So much for locked mysteries. But the gesture lingered, and someone had wanted it to appear sealed, not to be. The door, too, had been closed from the outside, the key placed back into Denning's drawer before dawn. Illusion, always illusion, dressed in protocol. Before leaving, I stooped once more beside the desk. The light from the quadrangle fell across a small smear on the floor wax, pale as bone. Candlelight where there should have been none. The college supplied electricity to every room. No one lit candles any more, except from habit or sentiment or secrecy. I scraped a flake of wax free and placed it in my pocket. Lewis rolled his eyes as though I were collecting dust. We left the room as we'd found it. The lock turned smoothly this time, as if grateful to resume its silence. Outside, the corridor stretched away in both directions, identical doors, identical brass plates. The sameness of Oxford, it guards corruption better than any wall. Walking back through the drizzle, Lewis asked what I made of the letter. I told him it said more in what it left unfinished. He laughed and said, I should have been a poet. Perhaps I was once, before reason became a profession. That night, alone in my room, I set the scrap of wax beside my crossword. The clue I'd left unsolved yesterday came back to me, barred from truth, but still illuminating. 6 letters. I thought of the candle, the lock, the quiet woman who had written until her heart stopped. Then I filled in the answer. Lantern. It was a curious gathering, that circle of editors and scholars who called themselves colleagues. The air in the senior common room had the faint musk of old sherry and self-congratulation, the residue of a dozen arguments disguised as conversation. Lewis stood uncomfortably near the sideboard, eyeing the sandwiches with suspicion, while I lingered by the window, watching rain gather on the panes like an audience waiting for its cue. Dr. Harcourt presided with weary grace. His hair had turned the colour of tarnished pewter, and the charm he once wielded like a weapon now served as armour. He was telling a story about Chaucer, or perhaps about himself. It was difficult to tell the difference. Across from him sat Helen Arkwright, the young poet with the eyes that never settled. She watched the men with a mixture of defiance and fear, the kind of gaze one reserves for gods and examiners. Felix Ashbourne, all elbow and irony, poured himself more claret and smiled too easily. It was, I thought, a room arranged like an argument, everyone out of sympathy, everyone pretending not to notice. They spoke of Dr. Graves with the reverent vagueness reserved for the recently dead. Harcourt called her meticulous, Ashbourne called her difficult, and Helen said nothing at all. I asked, quietly, about the paper she'd been editing. Harcourt's answer came too quickly, the words polished smooth from rehearsal. Merely an early draft, he said. She was helping with footnotes, nothing of consequence. The lie was not in what he said, but in how easily the others let it pass. Lewis, bless him, tried to make conversation about the weather, about college maintenance, about anything not dripping with guilt. But I had already noticed something, a small folder on the table beside Harcourt, half hidden under his glass. Its edge was blue, the same colour as the missing file mentioned in Graves's appointment diary. I asked if I might see it. He hesitated just long enough to make denial impossible, then smiled that tired academic smile and slid it toward Ami. Empty, of course, only a title page inside the proof. Mislaid at midnight. He claimed it was a lecture draft, a coincidence. Oxford breeds coincidences the way ponds breed midges unpleasantly, and in great numbers. I placed the folder back on the table, but the title lodged somewhere between my ribs. The phrase had surfaced too often now in her notes, her letter, and now this room. Proof of what, or against whom? Helen spoke for the first time. She said Eleanor had been troubled lately, that she'd mentioned discovering something rotten beneath the marble. Her voice faltered on that word. Harcourt laughed softly, the sound of polished glass cracking. Academic paranoia, he called it. Too much solitude among manuscripts, Ashbourne nodded, pretending agreement but watching me instead. I left the room before the conversation soured further. Lewis followed, relieved. The corridor outside was silent but for the hum of the old radiator. I asked him what he'd noticed. He said Harcourt seemed too relaxed for a man whose name kept surfacing in a dead woman's correspondence. I told him relaxation is often the most deliberate form of fear. He frowned, and he hated it when I spoke like that. Back in the quad, the bells of St. Anne's struck the half-hour, each note scattering pigeons from the eaves. Rain glistened on the flagstones, mirroring the long, dark windows. I thought of Dr. Graves alone in her room, typing into the night, her finger hesitating over the broken R. What was she trying to correct? Or perhaps she was trying not to. We stopped at the porter's lodge to sign out. A newspaper lay open on the counter, the crossword already half filled in by a hand far neater than mine. One clue caught my eye. Editor's error preserved in print. 5 letters. The answer came before I knew why it mattered. Fault, that was what she'd seen, what she'd died, for a fault not of the press, but of the human kind. Some corrections went wrong, some truth adjusted until it resembled civility. Lewis asked if I was all right. I said I disliked sherry, and that was true enough. But as we walked away, I felt the first contour of the pattern taking shape. The folder, the phrase, the missing proof, the word fault. Somewhere within that circle of scholars, someone had rewritten not just a paper, but a life. I returned home that evening to the familiar company of silence and whiskey. Outside, Oxford shimmered like a manuscript left in the rain, elegant, blurred, and half erased. I poured another glass and stared at the crossword until the squares dissolved into shadow. The answer to another clue hovered just beyond reach, something about deceit concealed by syntax. I closed the paper and whispered the word that would not leave me. Proof. Lewis and I returned to St. Hilda's under a sky the colour of faded slate. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick enough to mirror the college lamps. In that damp stillness, the place looked older, less academic, more like an institution designed to conceal remorse. The porter let us through without comment, though his eyes lingered on the folder under my arm, the blue one Harcourt had so conveniently misplaced the night before. Dr. Graves's room had not changed. Dust gathered in polite corners, the scent of furniture polish faintly overlaying the more human trace of ink and habit. I sat at her desk again and looked at the objects she'd left behind the typewriter, missing its R, the glass of stale water, the empty space where a stack of papers had once rested. I could hear Lewis pacing behind me, his steps irregular, like thought itself. He said it straight out that Harcourt must have killed her. I told him to lower his voice. There's something indecent about certainty when the evidence refuses to keep up. He asked what else we were supposed to think. I said perhaps we were meant to think too soon. It was then that I noticed the library slip tucked behind the blotter, a small, yellowed rectangle marked Special Loan Don's Sermons. The return date had passed 3 days before her death, a marginal curiosity, except that the sermon listed was on the proof of the resurrection. Lewis called it coincidence. I didn't bother replying. Oxford, I found, never believes in coincidence. It believes in patterns that haven't yet declared themselves. We went to the library. Its air was cooler, still a cathedral of paper, where time moved only in the turning of pages. The librarian, a thin woman with the distracted eyes of one who lives too close to silence, recalled Dr. Graves perfectly. She had come often, always alone, always borrowing books older than herself. I asked whether she had mentioned what she was researching. The woman hesitated, then said something about textual variations, the way meaning shifts when a single comma is moved, a scholar's obsession, but also perhaps a moral one. Lewis, impatient, asked if the librarian remembered seeing anyone with her. She nodded toward the far desk by the window. Dr. Ashbourne, she said. They had argued there one afternoon, quietly, but with intensity. Something about attribution. Ownership of an idea. We found Ashbourne later at his rooms in St. Anne's. He answered the door with a scholar's smile, the kind that pretends ignorance as defence. His study was chaos, unfiled papers, half-finished proofs, the sweet tang of sherry that had stopped pretending to be medicinal. I asked him if he knew of Graves's death. He did. He said it was tragic. The words sounded rehearsed. I asked what they'd argued about. He looked away. Editorial disagreements, he said, a matter of phrasing. Lewis asked whether she'd borrowed any of his drafts. Ashbourne laughed, but there was no humour in it. She corrected everyone, he said. That was her failing. Some people confuse accuracy with virtue. As he spoke, my eyes drifted toward a small stack of papers near the fireplace. On top lay a proof marked Final Revision, his name neatly typed beneath the title, the same paper Graves had been editing. I noticed faint pencil notations in the margins lighter than the rest, erased but not quite gone, her hand, surely. She had written a false referent beside one paragraph. I said nothing, but the phrase embedded itself like a thorn. When we left, Lewis remarked that Ashbourne seemed relieved rather than grieved. I told him relief and guilt are often twins. He frowned at that and muttered that I sounded like one of those poets she liked. I let it pass. Back in my room, I laid the library slip beside the erased note. Proof. Referent. Both words spoke of meaning detached from truth. Somewhere between her careful revisions and someone else's ambition, the proof had been altered after midnight. The thought felt heavier now, like a sentence still awaiting its subject. Before turning in, I opened my crossword. The clue at the top of the page read, Borrowed authority concealed in text. 8 letters. I stared at it longer than I meant to. The answer came slowly, almost reluctantly. Footnote. That was the connection. Quiet, unobtrusive, necessary. The truth always hides below the line where no one bothers to read. I closed the book and poured another measure of whiskey. The window pane reflected the lamplight and my own tired face behind it. Somewhere in Oxford someone was sleeping easily, believing the evidence had been tidied away like so many papers at the end of term. But the proof was still missing, and in the space it had left, a silence too articulate to ignore. I remember that evening, with a peculiar clarity, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The senior common room at St. Hilda's had the hollow warmth of a hearth long gone cold, its varnished tables reflecting the soft murmur of conversation and glass. It was the sort of gathering Oxford excels at intellectual morning disguised as polite conviviality. Miss Denning had insisted I attend. She said it was customary to raise a glass in memory of a colleague, though her eyes betrayed the unease of one honouring the living's silence rather than the dead's. I arrived late, and the hush that followed felt both rehearsed and genuine, a tribute to decorum perhaps, or to discomfort. Dr. Harcourt dominated the evening, as men like him always do when guilt hasn't yet been named. He stood by the fireplace, framed by the portraits of benefactors who seemed to frown upon excess. His toast to Eleanor Graves was short, almost tender. He praised her diligence, her devotion to truth, and her contribution to the college's scholarly reputation. The words fell neatly, like coins dropped into an empty well. I noted that he never used the word friend. Ashbourne, already unsteady from the wine, muttered to no one in particular that Eleanor's dedication bordered on pedantry. He laughed then too loud, too brief, and apologized to the room in a voice that wasn't quite his own. Helen Arkwright looked up sharply, but said nothing. She held her glass without drinking, her eyes fixed on the pattern in the carpet, as though deciphering some moral code hidden in its weave. I moved toward the sideboard, more to escape than to serve myself. The decanters were arranged with surgical precision, but one bore the smudge of a thumbprint, faint, deliberate. A small thing, yet it reminded me of the wax mark I'd pocketed from Eleanor's floorboards. Both suggested interruption, a moment when care had been lost. I poured only half a measure. Miss Denning drifted over, her voice low. She asked if I thought Dr. Graves had suffered. I told her I believed she had worked too hard. It was, in its way, an answer. She nodded, as if I'd confirmed a private suspicion. There are times when truth needs only a tone. Later, when the conversation loosened and wine had done its ancient work, I heard Ashbourne speaking again, this time to Harcourt. He said something about the journal's deadline, about whether the proof had reached the printer. Harcourt's reply was soft, but the rhythm of it caught my attention. He said she'd delivered everything required before midnight. The phrasing was oddly formal, and I wondered if he meant the article or something less academic. Helen came to stand beside me. She smelled faintly of tobacco and cheap perfume, the defiant aroma of youth pretending indifference. She asked if I believed the rumours. I told her rumours in Oxford were as reliable as Latin translations, always correct in form, rarely in meaning. She smiled at that small, weary smile that reached neither her eyes nor the truth behind them. Then she said Eleanor had loved precision too much, that it killed her, perhaps. I asked what she meant. She shook her head and whispered that some people mistake honesty for cruelty. When she left, I watched the candlelight tremble in the glass. The evening had grown humid, and a window somewhere had been left ajar. The curtains breathed faintly, like lungs reluctant to admit air. Harcourt was still talking, weaving scholarship and sentiment into something respectable. Yet every word seemed to polish the absence around him. Lewis arrived halfway through the second bottle, looking more like a constable than a guest. He gave me that look he reserves for gatherings of intellect, a mixture of confusion and disapproval. He asked quietly whether I was enjoying myself. I told him enjoyment was not the purpose of wine in Oxford endurance. He noticed Helen's empty glass and muttered that she looked frightened. I said she was merely learning that ambition and guilt often attend the same lectures. He said he'd found something in the registry, a note indicating Dr. Graves had withdrawn a small sum of money shortly before her death. It had been recorded as repayment for services rendered. He wanted to know what kind. I said we'd have to ask the right question first: to whom? The evening thinned after that. Chairs scraped gently against the floor, laughter curdled into politeness, and one by one the guests retreated into corridors that smelled of damp tweed and resignation. I was the last to leave. The fire had nearly died, leaving only a thin red glow along the grate. On the mantel lay a single folded napkin, marked with a faint ring of wine. Someone had written a word there in pencil, one small, deliberate word, altered. I carried it home with me, folded in my pocket beside the scrap of candle wax. Later, sitting alone, I set the napkin under the lamplight. A crossword waited, open beside it. The clue read, "Correction, mistaken for creation." 8 letters. I filled it in slowly, almost reverently. Revision. There are people who talk as though every footnote were a confession, and I've met enough of them to know they're often right. The man I was to see that morning, Dr. Felix Ashbourne, had written more footnotes than arguments. He lived alone in a set of rooms near the river, where the smell of damp and gin performed a sort of duet. He received me without surprise, though his eyes carried that sleepless sheen of someone rehearsing the past. He said he'd been expecting me, and I believed him. The guilty rarely expect absolution, but they always expect company. His study was chaos-rendered academic shelves buckling under monographs, Papers sprawled like casualties. A cat slept on the radiator with more dignity than its owner. I noticed immediately what wasn't there. No photographs, no diploma, no books by Dr. Graves, though she had reviewed his work twice. Absence can be a form of punctuation. He spoke before I could. He said he'd told me the truth already. He hadn't touched her. He'd gone home, locked the door, and worked through the night. I asked what he was writing. He smiled faintly and said, "The footnotes, always the footnotes." His hands were clean but restless. When he poured himself a drink, I saw the paper tucked beneath the decanter, a galley proof of his latest article. I could just make out the first line submitted posthumously by the late Dr. Eleanor Graves. I asked how that was possible. He said it wasn't meant literally. She had, in his words, helped shape it before her death. He called her a muse. I called it theft. He laughed a small, broken laugh and said she'd wanted her name included. He seemed to almost believe it. But on the proof, her name appeared only in a footnote marked with an asterisk and followed by 3 words. Editorial assistants acknowledged. It was the same phrase I'd seen in Harcourt's earlier papers. Academic erasure disguised as gratitude. He asked if I thought she'd been murdered. I said I hadn't ruled out suicide. He said she wasn't that kind of woman. I told him no one is until they are. That silenced him. For a while we listened to the rain ticking against the glass. There was something odd about his desk. The typewriter cover pulled slightly askew, as though replaced in haste. I lifted it. The machine was of an older make, the same model as hers, and when I pressed the keys, I found the R missing. He swore it was coincidence that she'd borrowed it once, or perhaps he'd lent it to her. But his voice faltered, and in that falter I heard the crack that had been waiting all along. Lewis, standing by the window, broke the quiet. He pointed to a wastebasket beside the desk. Inside were shreds of paper, each burned at the corner proofs, drafts, a letter half-charred. The only legible phrase read, "She found what was omitted." The words were typed, not written, and missing every R. I looked up at Ashbourne. He said nothing. His face had taken on that peculiar stillness of a man who realizes he's been living in someone else's footnote all along. Said she'd only wanted to correct a citation, something trivial. I told him corrections are never trivial. We left him there, standing in the light that had begun to break through the clouds. Lewis said it was enough to bring him in. I told him it wasn't yet. There were truths in Oxford that needed to ripen before they could be picked. Back at the station, I spread the fragments across my desk. The burned edges crumbled like the memory of an argument one refuses to refight. One corner bore a faint watermark University Press, trial-proof copy. That meant there had been 2 sets printed, not one. If she'd carried the original, then someone had retrieved it after midnight, when she was already dead. I turned to my crossword, half-finished from the night before. The clue read, "Annotation omitted in final version." 9 letters. It came to me, slowly, almost kindly. Footnotes, of course. The truth was never in the text, it was always in what the text tried to explain away. That night I poured myself another whiskey, and thought of Ashbourne in his river rooms, surrounded by ghosts of citations and debts unpaid. Somewhere, in one of those erased margins, Eleanor Graves still spoke quietly, precisely unacknowledged. The Oxford wind rattled my window, carrying with it a faint echo of typewriter keys, 1 letter forever missing. The blue folder appeared one afternoon in the most ordinary way, left on my desk at the station, without note or acknowledgement, as if it had wandered in of its own volition. I instantly recognized the same folder I'd seen under Harcourt's hand during that dreadful evening in the senior common room. Its surface still bore the faint watermark of a sherry glass, a ring like a deliberate signature. Inside were two things, a fragment of Dr. Graves's unfinished paper and a single poem written in another hand, Helen Arkwright's, I suspected. Both bore the traces of Eleanor's meticulous annotation. Her handwriting, small and exact, marked the margins like a teacher gently correcting her own life. Beside one line of the poem, "Proof sleeps beneath the candle's ash," she had written just one word, "dangerous." Lewis thought it sentimental nonsense. He said poets like to hide guilt behind metaphor. I told him metaphor was often just guilt that refused to name itself. He shrugged and said I was in one of my moods, which was true enough. But I could not stop staring at that word, dangerous, its letters pressed harder than the rest, as if she'd known someone would need to find it later. The accompanying essay fragment was dense, a meditation on Milton and moral agency, but her footnotes revealed more than the text. 3 citations had been struck through in faint pencil, all belonging to articles authored by Harcourt. And at the bottom of the page, in that same careful hand, she had written, "Areopagitica, the liberty of truth unlicensed." The line circled twice. I took the folder to the Bodleian. The librarian, who knew me too well to ask questions, found the journal issue Graves had been editing before her death. The article by Harcourt appeared under a different title now, Reason in the Night Watch, but the phrasing was unmistakably hers. I counted 4 sentences lifted nearly word for word from her earlier paper. She had discovered it, of course, but not in time to live beyond the finding. The discovery brought no triumph, only a kind of weariness, like listening to a confession after the penitent has died. Lewis read the poem again, scowling. He said it was pretentious. He said the young woman must have been infatuated, trying to immortalize her mentor in verse. I said perhaps she was trying to apologize. He asked for what? I told him I didn't know yet, but there was a pattern forming, faint and deliberate, like a watermark only visible when held to light. We found Helen that evening in the quad, standing beneath a row of lamps that had just begun to hum with the first stirrings of dusk. She looked younger than before, but more resigned, as if time had finally stopped pretending to pass. I asked about the poem. She said it was nothing but a student exercise and homage. I asked who had given her the blue folder. She said she'd found it in the college archives, misfiled under miscellaneous correspondence. Her tone was too steady. When I mentioned the word dangerous, she went still. Her eyes shifted to the chapel across the green where the last choir practice was ending. She said Eleanor had wanted to protect her. From what, she wouldn't say. Only that truth, once printed, can't be retracted. Then she left, walking toward the cloister without looking back. Lewis said she was hiding something. I said everyone in Oxford is hiding something. It's the city's most enduring course of study. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Helen's silence was not fear, but loyalty misplaced. Later, alone in my room, I spread the contents of the folder across the table. The candle beside me guttered in the draught. I traced her marginalia with my thumb, the careful underlining, the restrained fury in her final notes. And then I noticed something small, something almost laughably trivial in her last footnote. She had replaced Harcourt's page reference with the number 0, a deliberate impossibility. A silent correction. I turned to my crossword, the nightly ritual of futility and solace. The clue waiting there read, "Where false words are buried but not forgotten." 9 letters. I let the pencil hover, listening to the clock mark the minutes like dripping ink. At last, I filled it in. Footnotes. When I looked back at the blue folder, the candle had burned low, its wax spilling in quiet rivers over the edge of the desk. The poem lay open to the same line, and the word dangerous seemed darker now, more final. I poured another whiskey, careful not to spill it, and wondered whether truth, once unearthed, deserves to live at all. It was raining again, that thin, merciless rain. Oxford seems to produce on demand when the truth begins to smell too much like decay. I remember the sound of it on the windows of the interview room, precise, methodical, like fingers tapping on a typewriter missing one key. Dr. Ashbourne had confessed, not eloquently, not convincingly, merely confessed, as if the act itself might absolve him of the burden of having to explain anything. He said he'd gone to see Dr. Graves on the night she died, that they'd argued, that she'd collapsed after he'd shouted. He'd tried to help, he said, but fear had stopped him. The statement had all the right ingredients: guilt, remorse, opportunity. And yet as he spoke I felt that peculiar numbness that comes when one's instincts refuse to celebrate. Lewis thought it was done. He said a confession was a confession. I told him people in Oxford lie best when they're telling the truth. He frowned at what he always did when words failed to behave. The man sat opposite me with his hands folded neatly, his cuffs damp where he'd leaned too close to the table. He looked tired, but not destroyed. His eyes held that fragile calm of someone who'd rehearsed despair. I asked him to describe the argument. He said she'd accused him of plagiarism, of stealing her work. He hadn't denied it. He'd called her unreasonable. The word landed badly. He said she'd been trembling when he left. He thought she'd calmed down. When he finished, I asked one question. How did he know she'd died of heart failure? The silence that followed was honest. He looked up sharply, his face tightening around the realization. The post-mortem result hadn't been made public. I hadn't told him. His voice faltered, and for the first time, his eyes betrayed him. He said he'd assumed. I told him assumptions were just lies without the courage of conviction. He withdrew then, quietly. The performance was over. I let him go. Lewis was furious. He said we'd lost a confession. I said we'd saved one from becoming permanent. That evening, I walked through the college cloisters, where the rain collected in the cracks between stones, forming tiny, dark mirrors. The air smelt of damp paper and extinguished candles. I passed the chapel where Helen had once read her poem aloud. The memory returned uninvited, the tremor in her voice, the way she'd looked at Harcourt for approval and received only the faintest smile, the kind that forgives nothing. Inside the library, the night porter nodded and pretended not to recognize me. I retraced the steps of that first night, the path from the gate to the staircase, the narrow landing where the lamp had cast its tired light. The floor creaked where it shouldn't. A faint stain remained along the skirting board, scrubbed too clean to be accidental. Someone had spilled wax there again, though the college used only electric lamps now. Someone keeping vigil, perhaps. On Dr. Graves's desk, the dust had begun to settle into gentle authority. Only the typewriter remained as she'd left it. The broken R key hung slightly askew, as if it still resisted being pressed. I sat for a while, staring at it, listening to the rain soften against the glass. A thought returned, small but insistent, the note we'd found earlier, typed on a similar machine. She found what was omitted. Lewis arrived later, holding a fresh report. The letter from the printing press had come in. Harcourt's new article had been submitted not after her death, but before it time-stamped a full day earlier, meaning the so-called alteration after midnight had nothing to do with Ashbourne. He couldn't have been the one. The confession had been a shield, not a wound. Lewis said, "Then who?" I told him I didn't know, not yet, but someone had wanted the guilt to belong to a man already half broken. Oxford forgives that kind of guilt. It prefers it to scandal. When he left, I remained by the desk. I opened the drawer she'd locked with such care. Inside was a single page of the poem, the final stanza rewritten in her hand. The line I remembered had changed. Where it once read, "Proof sleeps beneath the candle's ash," it now said, "Proof burns when touched by light." I turned off the lamp. The rain had stopped at last. The air was thick with the scent of stone and regret. Somewhere beyond the quad, the bells began to strike the hour, 12 clear notes, too beautiful for what they marked. I took out my crossword from the inner pocket of my coat. The clue waiting there read, "Confession mistaken for conclusion." 10 letters. I wrote it without hesitation. Falsehood. And for once, I wished I could believe it. The library at midnight has a particular sound, not silence exactly, but a soft orchestration of things that no longer wish to be heard. The ticking of old clocks, the faint sigh of air moving between shelves, the delicate friction of paper settling under its own weight. I've always thought truth prefers such company, the patient, the unlit, the forgotten. It was raining again, a cold rain that darkened the quad to polished stone. Lewis had gone home hours earlier. I told him I had paperwork to finish, which was true, though not of the kind he imagined. I carried with me the blue folder, worn now along its spine, and that faint slip of paper from Eleanor's drawer, the rewritten line, "Proof burns when touched by light." The porter had left the library unlocked for me. A kindness, or perhaps a superstition. Either way, I entered quietly, closing the heavy oak door behind me. The air was dry, dust folded upon dust. I switched on only one lamp near the catalogue desk, where its small cone of light could serve as both confession and interrogation. Her presence lingered here, as it did everywhere in the precise spacing of her notes, in the faint indentation of her handwriting upon old sheets. I began to retrace her steps from the reference section where Don's sermons were kept, across to the carrel near the far window, where her chair still bore the outline of long hours. It was then I heard the low rustle of movement among the shelves. Not the brittle chatter of paper, but the deliberate sound of someone turning. I said nothing. The instinct to speak too soon has ruined many investigations and perhaps more friendships. A shadow detached itself from the far end of the aisle. Miss Denning emerged, wrapped in her raincoat, though the room was warm. She held an envelope in one hand, pale against the darker folds of fabric. Her face, always so measured, looked strangely young in the lamplight, the face of someone caught remembering. She said she couldn't sleep. I said neither could I. The envelope trembled faintly. She told me it had been hidden behind the library's donations ledger, slipped there years ago by Dr. Graves herself. She had found it tonight by accident. I asked how one finds an accident after midnight. She looked at me for a long moment before answering that accidents are often arranged. She handed me the envelope. It was addressed in Eleanor's hand to no one. Inside was the missing proof of her annotated version of Harcourt's article, margins thick with corrections, deletions, and one line at the bottom written in darker ink. He will sign what is not his, and I will die for it. The sentence struck like a bell, clear and undeniable. But still, the old caution in me stirred. A confession written is never the same as a confession meant. I asked Denning when she had last seen Eleanor alive. She said she'd come to her room near midnight, the night she died. She had begged her to destroy the paper to let the matter rest. Eleanor refused. Truth, she'd said, cannot be kept quiet by good manners. Denning looked away as she spoke, her gaze fixed on the rain gathering against the windows. I realized then that her loyalty had not been to Harcourt, nor to the college, but to the institution itself, to its illusion of cleanliness. She had hidden the proof not to protect a man, but to preserve the surface beneath which Oxford breathes. I asked if she'd come to return it. She nodded. But there was something else in her expression, not relief, not guilt, something nearer to grief restrained too long. She said she'd tried to make it right after Eleanor died, that she'd gone to the library that night, enveloped in hand, but by the time she reached her door, it was already too late. She had slipped it back into the shelves and said nothing. The clock in the hall struck 12. The sound expanded through the room like breath through an organ pipe. Denning whispered that Harcourt had never known she'd kept it, and that he would have destroyed it if he had. She said she would resign in the morning. I told her not to. The dead do not ask for punishment, they ask for memory. She left then, walking slowly down the aisle until the darkness took her. I remained at the desk, the proof open before me. The ink shimmered faintly under the lamplight, the final. Note still legible, no day reveals. I turned to my crossword, left unfinished again. The clue waiting there. Truth uncovered after darkness. 7 letters. I filled it in without thinking. Midnight. Outside, the rain softened to mist. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bell struck once more, and I realized, as I often have, that justice and mercy share the same hour. Morning arrived with that washed-out pallor Oxford wears after too much truth has been spoken aloud. The rain had ceased, though puddles lingered on the flagstones, patient as unfinished thoughts. I remember standing beneath the arch by the porter's lodge, the same arch where it had all begun, watching a lamplighter extinguish what little remained of the night. The world, for once, seemed reluctant to start again. Lewis joined me, coat unbuttoned, eyes dulled by too many unanswered questions. He asked if we'd done the right thing. I said I wasn't sure we'd done anything at all. He looked at me the way he does when he wants certainty, and I've none to give. Then we walked together towards St. Hilda's, our reflections dissolving in the shallow pools left by the storm. Miss Denning met us at the entrance to the library. She had resigned, as she said she would, but stayed on that morning to hand over the envelope and the proof, restored. Her hands trembled, though her voice did not. She said she'd read it one last time in the early hours, that it wasn't a paper about Milton at all, but about conscience. I told her most scholarships are, though few have the honesty to admit it. The document lay before us on the long oak table, its pages still bearing faint smudges of wax and rain. Harcourt's plagiarism was there, sentence after elegant sentence, now marked by Eleanor's corrections, a dialogue between intellect and betrayal. At the bottom of the final page, beneath all her notations, she had written a line that read like an epitaph: "Truth alters nothing. It only reveals what has already failed to hide." Lewis exhaled softly as though he'd been holding his breath for weeks. He said we should arrest Harcourt, though he sounded uncertain, as if the word itself felt vulgar in the face of so much quiet ruin. I told him the law can't prosecute vanity, nor pride, nor the small deaths caused by envy in academic corridors. He said I was being poetic again. I told him Oxford makes poets of us all, mostly by accident. We found Harcourt in his study. He didn't rise when we entered. On his desk lay a copy of his latest book, inscribed with his own name in looping blue ink. He poured wine into 2 glasses, though he drank alone. He said he'd heard from Denning already that the paper had been found. He didn't deny anything. He simply said Eleanor should have known that truth, like scholarship, is a collaborative pursuit. Then he smiled, faintly, and added that everyone who steals only the clever hides it well. Lewis stiffened beside me, but I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. We left him there, seated before the fire, a man surrounded by his trophies of borrowed genius. The smell of wine followed us into the corridor. Outside, the day had brightened without warning. The puddles now reflected light instead of sky. In that brightness, the story seemed almost finished, but not concluded. I have learned to distinguish the two. Later, alone in my flat, I placed the proof on my desk, beside the crossword. The day's clue, untouched until then, read, "Light returned after proof complete." 7 letters. I hesitated, then wrote it in. Reveal. I poured myself a whiskey, the cheap kind, the one that burns but doesn't pretend to comfort. I thought about Eleanor, about the lamp beneath the arch, about Denning walking home through the mist. They would remember her, of course, in polite footnotes, in quiet faculty conversations, perhaps even in the subtle avoidance of her name. Oxford's way of memorializing truth is to cite it sparingly. I turned off the lamp. The window reflected the room's faint disorder: papers, glass, cigarette ash. In the darkness, the proof glowed faintly under the streetlight outside, its pages breathing in and out like a sleeping thing. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, a bell began to toll, slowly, deliberately, indifferently. I listened until the sound faded into the distance, leaving only the whisper of the rain's return. Then I closed the folder, sealed it in its envelope, and slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk. Not destroyed, not delivered, simply kept as the dead sometimes must be in quiet custody,